Welcome to episode 2 of Behind the Pulpit, which is a podcast hosted by me, Matt Buckley, as well as Clark Ingleton and Gia Mai. Together, Clark, Gia and myself comprise the Incorrigible Pests. For this episode of Behind the Pulpit, we interviewed David Pooler, who has a PhD and is a professor of social work at Baylor University in Texas.
Can you talk about who you are, what your title is, and what you do?
Sure. I'm a professor of social work at Baylor University, and my undergraduate degree was in religion and psychology, double major, did a master's degree in social work, PhD in social work, and I'm currently at Baylor University. I've been here for 15 years.
Okay, so you did a study into clerical abuse of adults?
Correct.
So what was the reason why you did that study? What was the genesis of that study?
Sure. Well, actually, there's some layers to that. But the simple and quick answer is there was actually a survivor who approached Diana Garland, who was kind of a pioneer in this area. And she and I had already been in conversation and working together. And I had done some theoretical writing around this, but never collected any data. And the survivor approached Diana and was like, I need some help figuring out how to do a study. And Diana said, the fact is, why don't you let us do the study? In a sense, work with us around some of the things you're interested in, but let us do it, because her concern was that if she did the study and had it published, that there would be a lot of naysayers and just say you're a disgruntled survivor. So the results are obviously skewed and interpreted in a certain way.
What methodology did you use in this study? What was the question that you were asking? What was your hypothesis or your question that you were asking in this study?
Sure. I guess I had several questions, but I was really wanting to take a strengths-based approach. So one of the questions was, who are adult survivors of clergy perpetrated sexual abuse? There'd never been any national study that gathered just, if you will, it was there had never been a descriptive study, just describing who these folks were. So that was part of my quantitative methodology, just basically trying to understand who they were. It was a kind of a mixed method study. So on the qualitative side, I was really interested in what ways churches were healing and helpful to them after they reported abuse. I wanted to figure out, when churches are at their best, what do they look like? And so I had this question at the end of the survey: would you be interested in a follow-up interview? And it was sort of with the qualifier around, healing and helpful responses from the church when you reported. A lot of people responded and said, listen, most of my experience with the church has been utterly awful, but there was a little bit of positivity around that I wanted to talk to you about. Is that okay? So I said, sure, let's hear it. So in a sense, there were no major hypotheses. It was not an experimental design. It was really, when you don't know a lot about a topic, you basically try to describe first. And I would say that the qualitative research kind of thickened and deepened the understanding that I had of the survivor experience, because before they talked about what was healing and helpful, I did ask them to tell their story. And so I will just say this, that the qualitative research absolutely changed me, absolutely changed me. Doing 27 interviews with survivors, absolutely. It helped, I guess, wrap my head and heart around this entire process. And the other thing just to know about me is I'm also a clinician. So in addition to teaching social work and doing research, I also have an independent practice. And over the past few years, I've opened my practice up to adult clergy sex abuse survivors. So I have the experience of having done research and working directly with people in their healing process. So I have a pretty unique view into this whole situation that is occurring.
Okay, I want to go into more detail about your findings then. Is that the
Sure.
question?
So I think the things that really stood out to me, especially with the quantitative survey, is really how poorly churches respond to people who have been abused sexually by a leader. And, if you will, very complicit in kind of allowing that person to shape the narrative, to victim blame, and jumping right on board with the victim blaming, excluding, shunning, and removing often that person who's been victimized, believing the church leader at all turns. So that was something that really, really stood out. The other thing that stood out, now remember, at this point, this survey is now 8 years old, or this whole sort of research project is 8 years old, but I honestly don't think a lot has changed. Yeah, the only thing that I think has changed now at this point is that, well, here, let me just say this too, that on average, the abuse lasted 4 years. So it wasn't just a 1 or 2 time sexual encounter with somebody.
Are we talking about Ravi specifically? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Are we talking about Ravi specifically, or okay?
I am just talking from my research. Yeah, that abuse, the person was sort of under the clutches of an abusive leader for 4 years on average. And there were, in some cases in my research, up to 14 years. And, a lot of people will look at that and say, oh my gosh, how come they couldn't get out or didn't get out? I mean, obviously it's consensual at this point, that kind of a thing. But, and let me just sort of segue onto consent for just a minute. I think the other thing I clearly learned from my research and really better understood in fine-tuned details is that when there are power differentials between a leader and someone under their influence, consent really isn't possible. You can't make the argument, well, we were in this together, we both wanted to be sexual with each other, she said yes, that means it must have been okay, even though it may have been immoral or sinful. It certainly wasn't abuse or rape. But I've clearly learned, in sort of understanding the power dynamics, that it indeed is some version of sexual abuse, sexual assault, or rape that's going on when there's a lack of consent. And that became crystal clear. And I think I also better understood the grooming process that people use when they're trying to target a woman. And I continue to use the word woman, not that women are the only people who are victimized by clergy, but by and large, it is primarily heterosexual married men targeting and abusing women. Of course, there's other configurations, but that's just sort of the layout of Christianity, certainly in the United States and often around the globe, is that sort of gendered layout of leadership and sort of who the perpetrators are and who the victims are. So those are just a few of the things that I've learned. I think another thing that's important is, about in my study, about a third of the respondents, actually a little bit more than a third, no longer are a part of a congregation or community of faith. The church is now toxic. It's triggering to even try to walk through the doors of a religious institution. However, faith is still a big predictor of their recovery. So these, by and large, are people who still have faith, but it has nothing to do with the religious institution anymore. They've been able to sort of pull those apart and have had to.
Do you think this is the result of the abuse by the church or the manipulation by these figures? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that one of the things that makes this kind of
Yeah.
abuse unique is that is the way that we elevate and view pastoral figures, church leaders, and
Yes.
that they're not a complete stand-in for God, but yet we sort of elevate them to a place where they might be somehow different than the rest of us. And I honestly think
Okay.
that's a big, big mistake that we do that. But
Yes.
the fact is, because we do that, a lot of people in their own sort of recovery journey have a hard time disentangling God from this abuser and
Yes.
the abuser from the
Hmm.
institution that they've been
Absolutely.
a part of and pulling those things apart. So
It's a trauma
what
already.
that
Yes.
absolutely it's really
Yes.
a multi-layered trauma. Absolutely.
Yes. 100%.
So my understanding is when it comes to clerical sexual abuse of children, one reason that clerics who did that were able to get away with it for so long is because the clerics were put on a pedestal by the families. They were trusted people. They were people of God. So you're saying there's a similar thing going on when it comes to clerical sexual misconduct towards adults, that there's a
Absolutely.
pedestal?
Yeah,
Yeah.
no question. In fact, I'm starting to write a book about this, and I just sent off a proposal, to a publisher. But I, in the very first chapter, identify clericalism as a problem. And so let me just identify clericalism, because I think if we sort of look at all the cases of, cleric abuse, if you will, going on around the globe, clericalism sits at the heart of it. And it's the one ism that sits in the lap of the church, unlike a lot of other isms that can be found in multiple institutions. But clericalism is the elevation and veneration of a leader and their message and their priorities and their goals, to the exclusion of the interests and goals and priorities of congregants or laity. And what happens is, the more clericalism is present, the more that elevation and veneration is present. And interestingly enough, congregations literally give their power away to that person. And then that person benefits from that additional power and elevation and can really do things with impunity with that power differential present. Where if there's someone who's pushing back or trying to hold someone accountable or telling the truth about abuse, that leader can literally completely control the narrative and steer the ship wherever they want it to go. No, I'm the man of God. That's a lie. I've done
Mhm.
nothing to
Yeah.
abuse anyone. And people literally will just go along with that narrative because they've been so taught to do that. Sort of having my own power as a congregant could be a problem. Or if I confront or embarrass or call out a leader, that's just really not okay. That's non-submissive, that's evil, those kinds of things. So that's how clericalism sort of sits at this, and it goes unchecked and unnoticed. And of course, I would just say this, that all the leaders who benefit from clericalism, they have no incentive whatsoever, none, to call it out, to name it, because they're the beneficiaries of it. They get to be the ones with power. And if they want to abuse someone or do something unethical or immoral, they can literally do so under cover of their power and position, and then step on and squash anyone who basically tries to interfere with that.
Yeah. So what are the psychological effects of uh, sexual abuse of adults by clergy? Did you find anything about that?
I guess I sort of will go back to something I sort of mentioned earlier, which is just multi-layered trauma. I mean, those folks end up with PTSD. Honestly, that's probably the
Yes.
primary thing. And the particular in what we're actually seeing, there's a particular kind of trauma that is getting more traction that we're sort of talking more about in relation to this issue, and it's simply called betrayal trauma. And with betrayal trauma, avoidance and numbing are two of the primary symptoms of that. But there's also continued ongoing work that's elevating an idea called institutional betrayal, or IB. And so generally people who've experienced this kind of betrayal have it both betrayal by a trusted leader and then institutional betrayal. And those two things really leave people devastated psychologically. And so a lot of self-doubt, low self-esteem, especially
Yes.
after this. I haven't met a survivor yet that didn't have some suicidal ideation or really contemplated just killing
100%.
themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, and they also, by nature of the way the institution is responding to this, the nature of the betrayal is the survivor often feels like she did something wrong. It was her fault. What could she have done differently? She should have stopped it. So, and none of those things are true whatsoever, but those are generally what survivors are left with in the aftermath.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier something about the lack of consent, or the ability of someone to consent. Would you say it's similar to that of, say, a therapist and a patient? A therapist, they're not allowed to get with their patients because there's a massive breach of trust if that were to happen, and a massive power imbalance.
Yes,
Is
it's
it
the
similar?
exact same dynamic.
Yeah. And you can imagine, say if you've lost a child or lost a family member and you're grieving and you're looking for some kind of spiritual comfort or some kind of meaning in life and all that, and you go to the cleric for comfort and guidance, and yeah, the ability of the cleric to take advantage of your vulnerable state would certainly be there.
For sure, all of that was present, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. In my survey, I found that 65% of the respondents reported, and I had worded the item this way, but unresolved trauma prior to the abuse.
Yes.
So 65% of the respondents reported that, strongly agreed with that statement. And so, yes, these abusing pastors and leaders are targeting a need or a vulnerability. And so let me go back to the therapist-client relationship. So what's interesting, if you, certainly at least in the United States, I can speak to this, but doctors, psychologists, social workers, nurses, lawyers, all these professions generally have codes of ethics that prohibit sexual relationships or romantic relationships with clients. And so if one of those should occur, it would absolutely be misconduct. A licensing board of some sort could or would step in and intervene and monitor, or in some cases actually remove that person's license. But the problem with clergy, it is the most unregulated profession that exists on the globe. And certainly in the United States, with our separation of church and state, it's a big issue where generally the state does not get involved in any way in regulating clergy. So one of the things that I've actually been working with groups of allies and survivors and others is to criminalize the abuse of adults by clergy at the state level, to have state statutes. So it doesn't regulate clergy in any way, but it does make abusing an adult by misusing their power and position to do it, it makes it a criminal offense. And so at the moment, we only have 14 states in which that's happening. And there's a move afoot, if you will, to make this happen in more places. I'm aware, I'm trying to think right now about 5 other states where people are working right now on getting some state statutes. But the other professions completely understand the power dynamics and consent and how that's not possible in a relationship in which there's a power differential. But for some reason in the church, even to this day, people can go and claim it was an affair, which completely minimizes it, doesn't get at the dynamics, and then allows the congregation to move quickly toward forgiveness, which is often the way the narrative plays out. We need to forgive the pastor. We need to move on. It was just a moral slip. And I really just think that's such a disservice, because in no other profession would it simply be a moral slip. Like if I, as a social worker, were sexual with one of my clients, no one could or would ever just name that a moral slip. The therapist needs to be forgiven. No, I'd be held accountable. I could lose my license. And so we just don't have parity around how we think about these issues with the church and with clergy persons. And I think that we have a great deal of work to do to make sure that that changes.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of like different sort of power imbalance things going on. Like these clergies like see themselves like they can get away with it because they're not an authority figure like doctors, lawyers, nurses, and things. They target people who have had a history of trauma, who are vulnerable, and they get an opening in that way, and then they can stand to be more innocent because, you know, they're not officially having a position of authority over the people they're abusing. When they do, like, they're employed, they're, you know, looked up to, and yeah, it's just the same as, like, you know, a doctor being a
That's right.
Oh,
totally.
Do you guys, I'm sorry, they're my friends. I'm from Southeast Europe. They're in Australia. So I was wondering whether actually in Australia there's something like criminalization of the cleric. How do we say clergic? Or I'm sorry, how was the adjective? Clergy? Clerical, I'm sorry.
Yeah, clergy or
So,
cleric, either one. Yeah.
Okay, they're both adjectives, actually.
Clerical.
They're both adjectives.
Well,
So,
clergy.
They're both nouns, I would say.
Clergy would be a noun.
Yeah, clergy.
Okay, then clerical.
Cleric.
Okay, cleric. No, cleric is a person, or am I wrong?
Yeah, cleric
This is interesting to
noun
differentiate.
too. Yeah, clerical. Yeah.
Is an adjective.
As an adjective. And clericalism. Okay. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Clericalism, there is
not
also
an English major.
What's the name of the charge? Okay. Where you say it's illegal in some states, or you're trying to get it made illegal. What's the name of the charge? If a cleric engaged in quote unquote affair, which is actually abuse, with the congregation member, what's the name of the charge that they get?
Yeah, good question. I think it can vary, and that's one of the challenges that we have is that some states will view it as a misdemeanor, some will view it as a felony. But I'm most familiar with the one in Texas. Thankfully, Texas has a good one, but it actually goes under it's under the sort of whole area of charges around sexual assault. And it comes up under that. And it's actually listed in the same place if you were a doctor or a therapist or whatever. And so it's just an additional line under that talks about if you're a clergy person and and someone is under your care and you're using your position to influence them in any way, even if it's not counseling, because some states will put it under the heading and make it more narrow, like it happens under, like they're being counseled. And in my research, about 60% of the time it had started and continued as in a counseling type relationship that the victim would have labeled counseling, but in 40% of the time it's discipleship, it's friendship, it's, you know, just a caring conversation where it started.
Yeah, well, like I said, I just imagine like someone who's maybe lost a family member like to death, and might just be going to church looking for some kind of guidance or meaning to life, or hope that their family members with the angels or whatever. And yeah, how easy it would be for a cleric to take advantage of that person's situation.
Absolutely. And I would honestly say that when I think back to the qualitative study, every time someone had a need, a death in the family, marriage problems, mental health challenge of some sort like depression, and either sought pastoral care for that, or the offender actually noticed that they were in need and offered their service and guidance to them. But that's absolutely spot on.
But so your study was into sexual abuse of adults. So what kinds of sexual abuse were we talking about? Where the power dynamic, or are we talking about actual physically assaulting someone? I mean, what I mean is, what kinds of sexual abuse were you looking at?
Right. The way that I defined it was, I mean, it can go from anything from a really sexualized conversation, which honestly, what I found out was highly damaging and confusing for people and a breach of trust, all the way to anything that would kind of be under sexual harassment and sexual assault statutes in other places. So we're talking anything from, touching sexual organs, masturbation, having sex with each other.
Talking about these topics, or because you said sexual conversation, or you mean because this is obviously a sexual assault?
Crossing actual physical boundaries
Okay.
into actually doing them.
Well, that's already
certainly talking about those things. But then crossing boundaries into all those other things, all the way.
Yes.
It's interesting. I'm using the term. So well, I would just say this about intercourse. I've been saying intercourse and then rape, but part of it is the way that the word consent goes in this. Sometimes I'm beginning to wonder if we're actually, at least in the United States, in the way that we talk about sexual assault, there's actually more rape going on, but we're not talking about some of the stereotypes of rape where it's forced and it's violent. Rape has to do everything about actual consent, the ability of that person to make a clear yes or a clear no. And I think in these situations, without that lack of consent, that there is actually more technical rape going on than we've ever been able to sort of name. And I think society has a hard time with that. But pretty much anything under the sun, from talking about sexual things all the way to any kind of sexual behavior that can occur between two people is what happens in clergy sex abuse of adults.
I believe in the USA, the crime of child-adult sex is called statutory rape. Is that right? Because a child cannot consent. I think that's
yes.
It doesn't have to be just children, though, can it? Or like it can be adults too. Like if if an adult consents to, I don't know, like sexual interaction with an authority figure, is that still statutory rape or?
I think not. At least my current understanding of statutory rape is it has to do with people that are underage, under the age of consent. And that does vary by state. In the United States in particular, it can, in some places it's 16, some places it's 17.
But it has to be it's with an authority figure, or just it could be not with an authority
no
figure.
Statutory rape is not about an authority figure. It's just someone who's an adult and then someone who's under the age of consent.
And I agree, it's statutory rape.
But what should churches do when they get confronted, or when there's rumors, or when there's reports about what you've talked about, adult sexual abuse of adults by clergy? What have they done, and what should they do?
As I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the responses are awful. They don't believe, they dismiss, they try to silence. So what they should do is the exact opposite. Is when a report is made, the first, the immediate best and first response should be, I believe you. How can we support you? So believing, supporting, and immediately taking action then to remove a perpetrator from ministry. It doesn't have to be expelled right away, but immediately removed from serving people directly. And often that doesn't occur because you want to protect other people and acknowledge the level of the harm that has occurred. So those are just a few immediate things that need to happen. And here's another thing I would just say. I don't think churches are capable of investigating themselves or getting to the bottom of allegations very easily. What I continue to learn is that you have to have someone from the outside who has no vested interest in protecting themselves, right? You just have to.
Themselves,
Absolutely, for sure. So those are just a few of my thoughts about what needs to happen, but the survivor needs to be centered.
So
You
Because
mean in the center
oftentimes
of
we-
attention? That's what
you
you
think
mean?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the center of the effort, of the energy, of the church response should center the survivor and their
Yes.
experience, which is the exact opposite of what we do most of the time, which is to continue to elevate and protect and be all concerned about the offender.
Oh,
So do you think the accused should get a right of reply? Say if an allegation is made, you only say we should believe the one who's making the allegation. Should the person who's being accused, should they get a right of reply, or what should happen there?
I think so. And so there's the scientific literature is a little not completely clear here, but what they've looked at is the percentage of false reporting, and it's really low actually. So whenever people bring up issues around being sexually assaulted or sexually abused, about 95% of those accusations, if you will, are true. So yes, if someone is being accused, they should have a right to share whatever they want as far as their side of the story. But I would just say it this way: people don't just in general don't make this up, especially with regard to churches. I just have never seen, I mean, because the way clericalism shows up, you are literally punished and excluded and stepped on for bringing this up the way that most churches currently handle it, right? You are kicked around for a while before you're believed, and that clearly needs to change. So I'm just saying is that it just makes no sense that someone would sort of make this up. So I would treat every person who's bringing this up as credible until evidence starts to emerge that they're not. And what we often do is we immediately dismiss someone bringing this up as not credible for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Okay. Did Gia and Clark have any questions?
I do actually. So I'm a mentor, actually, a life coach, and I want to study social work so I can actually work in Australia, something like that, because I'm fast.
Sure.
I mean, I've been doing this for a very long time. I just need, I'm fairly experienced, but I want to ask you, I mean, I know my answer. Let's say I know from my studies, but do you know the reason why these people follow these kind of like authorities?
Yeah, let me see if I can respond to that. I mean, I think there's probably several different reasons. So I guess it goes back for me to clericalism again, this elevation of folks. And I think that there many times our religious institutions actually socialize and teach people not to trust themselves.
Yes, exactly. That's yes.
Yeah. And so
That's my
they
yeah.
they tend to just then trust the authority figure. And what I do know is that these abusive clergy persons play on
Yes.
the strings of the
their
needs that are present in the person. And for example,
Yes.
these show up, and the needs themselves are fine. They're just human needs: a need to belong, a need to feel
Yes.
seen, a need to be
Yes.
important, right? We all have those. But these abusive clergy persons
abuse the vulnerability
use
actually.
those needs and
Yes.
sort of use that as a way to continue to gain access to
Yes.
somebody.
Yes. So do you think they do it consciously? Do you think these people do you think yes, that's what makes them offenders more or less because they do it? Yes.
Yeah, they're very narcissistic types of personalities.
Yes.
And
Yes,
and I do think with narcissism,
yeah.
people are not always fully conscious of their motivations. But we can say narcissism is about using and taking from others to feed their own needs.
Okay.
And so instead of being
Yes.
able, I think power should be used to protect, to keep safe, and to help someone
Yes.
grow and develop as a human being. And instead, these abusive persons are, taking from and using that person to feed their own unmet needs. And so, yeah, so how conscious that is, I'm not sure.
Yes, I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I mean, the audience might not know, but yeah, conscious would be right. Conscious would be, thought through and everything. But yeah, probably because they're hurting someone, they're not as conscious of their unmet needs, like you talked about. But yeah.
Right. And in their narcissism, they're certainly not thinking, I don't think consciously, I'm injuring somebody. I
Yes.
think, if anything, their narcissism says, I'm entitled to this.
Yes.
I
Most
can
likely,
get what
yes.
I want.
Yes.
So, Clark, do you have any questions?
In like churches and places of authority, do you think the reason why they're able to get away with horrible things is it like a money thing, like money based, like jobs being at stake and all that, or is it purely faith based, like, what we believe in is right and just and what we're doing is okay when it's not? Yeah, like, because I work like as a painter by trade, like a house painter, and I've painted in a Mormon church. You can see that there's billions of dollars poured into these places from countries all over the world. Like, there's just so much money, and I assume in other religions such as like the Jehovah's Witness church and things like that, and other Christian churches and other just religious churches, like, yeah, there's so much power in terms of money and jobs and status. So yeah, the fact that churches get away with
Who is paying all of this? My question is, like, if we know that the church can be abusive for religious figures, but that's, it's been with years, right? With centuries and millennials that churches have proven themselves to, to not meet the expectations, let's say, or the things that they say they are, because a lot of them turn out abusive. So, but
Yeah, I think this is my opinion, but I think that money is in the equation, but the money is part of the means to the end, and the end in this case is the power and the influence. And so I think when people see the money, if you will, in there, that it legitimizes the claims that the church is making, that we are powerful, God blesses us, we, that kind of thing. And I think, in some cases, churches will try to silence people with money. I mean, there's no question about that. The Catholic Church in particular just has thrown money at this problem, rather than doing justice or reforming the church in some way. The Catholic Church just tends to, what do we need to do to make you go away? We'll give you some money.
Yeah, well, the great irony of sex abuse cover-ups to protect an institution's reputation is that they damage the institution's reputation as the opposite effect of what it's intended, because the cover-up comes out. Now, say if you've got an organization, say if it's an atheist group, or whether it's a scouting group or a church, whatever. If it turned out there was sex abuse, if the organization did the right thing, reported it to the police, showed every support to the victim, that would make the organization look good, that they did the right thing. But when you cover it up to protect the reputation of the organization, it has the complete opposite effect of what it's intended.
I completely agree. And one of the things that I've noticed, at least in the United States, is that churches will rely on legal counsel. They'll, go to lawyers to figure out how to manage this. And the truth is, lawyers will, in a sense, the lawyers' advice that they're giving these churches is the exact opposite, in a sense, of what the right thing to do would be as far as Christians would consider. Let's own it, let's take responsibility, let's make it right. But the moment you do any of those things, you have admitted guilt and are therefore opening yourself up to liability and lawsuits and other things like that. So the legal counsel and legal advice is often not to do the right thing. And that's really, really unfortunate. But I completely agree. I mean, what churches end up doing is they prioritize their reputation and their own image over the truth. But then the truth always comes out and damages their reputation far more than if they had just done the right thing in the first place. Yeah, I'm with you there.
So has there been any impact of your report? Say, have churches responded to what you said, or have governments said, okay, we'll take action against this problem? Has there been any outcome of your report, of your studies?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, not nearly as much traction as I would have liked. I think that the change is so slow going. And so on some level, I have been asked to testify at state legislative meetings where they're considering bills or statutes to criminalize this. So I've had the opportunity to testify there and bring my expertise to the table. But as far as any widespread traction or movement, like people are just sort of looking at the work that I've done and saying, wow, we need to reform the church. No, not at all.
So you said a couple of states, 13 states are already implementing that criminalization. So where did that idea come from? If it wasn't you, I mean.
No, there
Okay.
there was Minnesota was the first state here in the United States that criminalized this about 30 years ago. And there was a psychologist who was really at the forefront of pushing that. And I'm sorry, I cannot remember his name at the moment. Love to give him some credit. But no, there have been, I guess the very first person to really ever deal with this was a woman named Marie Fortune, and she's still living. And I want to say the book that she wrote is titled "Is Nothing Sacred?" But she was really the first person to sort of identify this issue a good 30 years ago. And no one really focused on adult clergy sex abuse really until about 05, 06, when my predecessor at Baylor University, Diana Garland, started getting involved in that. So we've just had not a lot of focus on this issue. So really, unless someone outside the broad religious institutions that exist want to study it, because there is no incentive on the inside to study this. Because what would happen is, I think clericalism would have to get dismantled in some way, and there's too many people benefiting from the status quo. So I don't think change is going to come easily. I think change is going to come only through legislative action, through pressure, through conflict. I just don't think change is going to be organic and natural from the inside out of our religious institutions. Unfortunately, I'm just being a realist here.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was the name of the book? I'm sorry, by Marie Fortune. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Nothing
Yeah, I want to
sacred.
say
Nothing. Yes.
Yeah, is Nothing Sacred? I can actually look it
Okay.
up real quick. Hold on.
That's okay.
I actually want to get it right because I want to give credit to her.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay, yeah, Marie Fortune. It's actually Is Nothing Sacred? ? The story of a pastor, the women he sexually abused, and the congregation he nearly destroyed.
Okay.
And that book has been around a long time now.
Well, if I was involved in any organization that worked with children, I'd be making sure there's contingency plans in place to prevent sexual abuse of children. Now, obviously, religious organizations need to have those policies and contingency plans, but they also need to deal with prevention strategies and contingency plans for adult sexual abuse of adult or clergy sexual abuse of adults. This needs to be done. So even if it hasn't happened yet in a particular organization, they need to take action to prevent it and to have contingency plans in case it ever does happen.
Completely agree. Absolutely. And I actually developed a best practice guide back in 2017 that it sort of provides some broad guardrails, if you will, for people, kind of how this happens, what's happening, how do we prevent it, and how do we respond. And I agree. And I just think that that takes effort and energy And here's one of the interesting things I would say about it. Because of clericalism and that power imbalance, the reason that congregations and laity benefit from that, and this is going to be interesting here, I mean, that they lose in so many ways, but one of the ways that they benefit is being able to sort of let that church leader take responsibility for everything. So, if you will, there's some literature on what we would call the non-protecting bystander, and I think so many people in churches are what we call non-protecting bystanders. You know, there's something going on where someone's getting injured, but we're just bystanders and we don't step in to protect. And I think if we were to do a better job preventing this, it would require more of laity and congregants. They would have to step up, step in, be far more engaged in working within, for example, a local congregation to prevent abuse, and asking that pastor to talk about clergy sex abuse from the pulpit, you know, on an annual basis, to say, hey, there may be survivors in this church who've been abused other places. You're welcome here, you're safe here, or whatever. But we just don't do any of that. And yeah, so I'm completely with you on that assessment, that just in the same way we would do that with children, we should be doing that with adults. And I think there's a lot of things that we can be doing, but first of all is naming it clearly and providing regular information about defining adult clergy sexual abuse, that it's a thing, if you will, because there's still a lot of places, again, they don't even acknowledge it's a thing. Oh, the pastor just had an affair. I mean, the churches still use that language so frequently. It literally disgusts me at this point.
Yeah, well, there was a huge backlash in Boston, I believe, when the Catholic Church sexual abuse of children cover-ups were exposed by the Boston Globe. It was protests because I believe that has a very high Catholic population, if I'm not mistaken, Boston, and there was a huge backlash. There was, yeah, people saying, or Catholics saying, what you've done is wrong, and it does show that they are a force to be reckoned with, the people in the pews. And there's a Roman Catholic cleric / priest. He is an advocate for sexual abuse in the church. His name is Father Tom Doyle, I believe. And I think in a documentary film I saw about this issue, he says the church is the people in the pew. I think his words were. And I think, yeah, that's something that you need to remember. If you're in a church or any religious organization, you should have a say in what goes on. The people in the pew should have power there.
Couldn't agree more. And it's interesting, in my best practice guide, one of the things that I lead out with is that there should be more sharing of power. That if a leader is worth their salt, basically they're focusing on anti-clericalism, really trying to dismantle and level that power differential, and giving congregants tools and resources, information, and the ability to speak into the life of the church in ways that benefit everyone, benefit them, and even benefit their leader. Because I think one of the things that we need to do is, I mean, if a congregation is really dealing with this well, I think that what they would do is acknowledge that there is always the potential for someone to abuse a vulnerable person. And so that means having high levels of accountability around them, making sure they have leave and time off, and that they're getting continuing education around this issue. Does that make sense? So I think that congregations have a responsibility there. You're right. I mean, I think some congregations use their power well, but most, again, with clericalism, are disempowered and taught how not to use their power. And that's the sort of at the core, the problem with clericalism.
What about the role of women? Because you mentioned that the overwhelming majority of perpetrators of adult sexual abuse by clergy are men, and the vast majority of victims are women. So do you think women need to have, should there be practices in place to make sure there's enough women in positions of power to make, as part of the contingency plan, to make sure they've got a say, women and girls generally? Do you believe? Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm totally with you. And it's really interesting. Baylor University does have a seminary here, and I'm asked every academic term to come over to the seminary and talk with seminarians about this. Thankfully, Baylor does train and include women in both their faculty and seminary students, and believe that women can be in ministry. But what I basically said is any institution that does not include women in leadership, that in and of itself is cultivating an environment where sexual abuse of vulnerable people is more likely to occur. And
Yes.
so I think including women, elevating women and bringing them into leadership is a part of the prevention process. It doesn't make, it will never ever kind of prevent it completely. But I think what you're doing is you're starting to erode those dynamics,
Absolutely.
those major gendered differences where men are seen as more powerful than women, or men are seen as more important than women, things like that.
Men are, however, natural leaders. It's
Well,
natural for men to lead. But yeah, I personally would say that women
I
do
think
need
that's
to
more,
be
I'll be honest
sometimes.
with you. I think that's more cultural about what your statement, I think, is far more
Okay.
cultural than
Okay, maybe.
sort of
Yeah.
an actual gender difference. I mean, I think women can lead very, very well. Like
Yes.
Diana Garland
Yes.
was the dean of our school. So I'm just saying,
Okay.
I think that your statement may be
That's
true,
true.
but it's more an artifact of how societies have been, rather than men are actually better leaders in some way.
Yes,
I
yes,
guess
I agree.
people
I'm
can
coming from
disagree.
Southeast Europe, so
Yeah.
yes, I'm
Okay.
raised in a conservative, but I've been learning from the American culture a lot, so I understand what you mean. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Any more questions from or comments from Clark and / or Gia?
Not from me. No. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. But yeah, no, it's been very interesting, very fun. I'm not sure if that's really the
Yeah,
right
very
word to
enriching,
describe it.
helpful.
Yeah, no, it's been very good.
Yeah. So anything else you'd like to add to this discussion?
I think the only other thing that I would add, I remember early on when we were conversing, Gia, about this. And do you go by Kayleen instead of Gia?
Yes. Gia Kalin.
Okay.
I'm Gia Kalin.
Oh, Gia
Yes.
Kayleen. Okay,
Yes,
Gia
Gia
Kayleen.
Kalin.
Okay, got it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I know initially when
Yes.
you reached out, it was going to focus a little on Rabbi Zacharias, but I guess all I would simply say is when you look at that whole story, it's
Okay.
just a little case study of what I just talked about. And I
Yeah,
would say it happens everywhere, from really kind of smaller churches to the Catholic Church to big
Mhm.
figures, who are very,
Yes.
very popular, to those who have far less
Yeah.
influence on a broad level, but have a high
Mhm.
level of influence among a much smaller group of people. So those power dynamics are really the same,
Yes.
whether you have a grip on 200 people in a small local congregation, or you have thousands of admirers around the globe like Rabbi Zacharias. So it's,
Mm.
and we see in that
Really?
story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Matthew
ahead.
is our host. Matthew is our host. I also thought that we were gonna focus on Ravi. But sometimes the general, of course, it's necessary just to prevent future situations like these. I mean, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
No, go on.
so going
Yeah.
back to that, I guess the piece that's so interesting is
Yes.
both Ravi and his sort of organization immediately defended him, and he made statements of innocence and all these kinds of things. And of course, I mean, all that, I guess what I would just simply say is, if you want to see sort of a very prominent, elevated case of this, that was it. That's exactly what I found. And unfortunately, getting traction and making change in this area continues to be a challenge. So I'll just, I mean, that was it. And y'all don't have to include that in the conversation.
No, we will.
but-
No, it's
Well,
important.
It's
Yes,
up to you.
to
Yeah.
hear you're our guest. We need your opinion for our audience for sure. Yes, so
Yeah.
Was a nice
Okay.
closure, more or less.
right.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I think we can wrap it up there. You've certainly added a lot of
Sure.
fascinating and important information, David.
And thoughts and
mhm.
everything. Yes, thank you for
Yes.
sharing your
Thank you so
experience
much.
and beliefs.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah,
thanks.
no problem. I appreciate the invite. I'm looking forward to see how this all turns out. Yeah, this has been fascinating. I appreciate the interest in the topic. And I think that the more we have people doing what you're doing by saying, hey, let's talk about this. Let's
Yes.
see what can we learn? What can we do? I
Yeah,
think, the more that this happens, the better.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
we'll try and put it out public on YouTube, Spotify, things like that. And
iTunes.
we're not expecting iTunes, we're not expecting these podcasts yet to get like huge numbers and hits and things. But
Why not? We'll see. Maybe
Yeah,
people.
that's
No,
right.
well, if you think
Break-
about it, really, this kind of topics are important to dive deep into, just like we did today, and get some solutions and ideas. Yeah.
we'll break 1 million this one. This one will break.
You're 5 million in Australia, so just
Yeah. I think we're about 18 million, 20 million in Australia, I think.
okay. Sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. 25 actually. Sorry. Yes, 5 million in New Zealand. Apologies.
Wow, y'all are rocking.
Yes,
Yeah.
25. Yes, exactly. Of course.
Yeah.
It's a continent.
Like rabbits.
I'll come there and make more. Australia.
We'll leave it there unless anyone else wants to add anything.
No, that's it.
Yeah,
thanks very much, David.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
This has
I'm
been-
honored
you
to
had a
have
good
been
time.
here. Thanks so much. Yeah, me
Same.
too. Enjoyed
Pleasure
the
to have
great
you.
questions.
All right. Thank you.
Today,
All right.
thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.
Ciao.
Okay, guys, thank you.